Imagine yourself in ancient Judea, a land of dusty hills and tension, where the weight of the Roman Empire presses down on every family. Life here is harsh and uncertain, especially for the ordinary people who struggle daily to survive. Our story doesn't begin with a king or a hero, but with a child born in obscurity, a boy named Jesus born to Mary and Joseph in the small village of Nazareth. At this moment in history, Judea is ruled by King Herod the Great, a man remembered as much for his grand palaces and construction projects as for his cruelty and fear of losing power. Herod's reign is marked by violence, heavy taxation, and the constant presence of Roman soldiers. The people labor in the fields and markets trying to scrape together enough to live, always aware that their lives can be changed or ended by the whims of their rulers. Yet it is in this world of hardship and fear that Jesus comes of age. He is not born into privilege or wealth. His family is like countless others, working hard, staying close, dreaming quietly of freedom. Jesus learns the trade of a carpenter from Joseph, helping to build homes and tools for neighbors who, like them, live under the shadow of empire. What sets this story apart is not a miraculous birth in a palace, but the power of humble beginnings. As unrest simmers, Herod's death, rebellions, and new waves of Roman authority, few would imagine that this carpenter's son would leave a mark on history. But history is often shaped by those who rise from ordinary lives, carrying with them the hopes and struggles of their people. As the world around him holds its breath, Jesus' journey begins not with fanfare, but with quiet resilience and a longing for something greater. The world that shaped Jesus was far more complex than a remote countryside cut off from civilization. Recent archaeological discoveries have changed how we imagine his early life. Nazareth, though small, was only a few miles from Sepphoris, a bustling city filled with Greek culture, Roman commerce, and urban energy. It was a crossroads of languages and ideas. For generations, many believed Jesus grew up in an isolated rural village untouched by the currents of the wider world. But in reality, Sepphoris was booming, while Jesus was a boy. Stonecutters, craftsmen, and laborers from nearby towns, including Nazareth, traveled to Sepphoris to work on new buildings, roads, and marketplaces. It's likely that Joseph and even young Jesus spent time there earning a living among a melting pot of people, Jews, Romans, Greeks, and others from across the empire. This urban connection left a mark. To thrive in Sepphoris, people needed to know not just Hebrew or Aramaic, but Greek, the language of trade, ideas, and politics. Jesus' world then was not isolated, but connected, dynamic, and full of cultural friction. He grew up seeing how the Roman Empire shaped every aspect of daily life, from taxes to architecture, from language to law. And yet for Jews in this era, there was still only one true center, the temple in Jerusalem. The temple wasn't just a building, it was the beating heart of faith, hope, and national identity. It was where every major religious festival drew huge crowds, and where the people came to feel close to their God. To be Jewish was to believe in one God, one temple, and one people, even as new ideas and cultures pressed in from every side. But not all Jews saw their world the same way. Some, like the Pharisees and Sadducees, debated the meaning of the law and the right way to live. Others, like the Zealots, were ready to fight for freedom from Rome. The Essenes, meanwhile, retreated into the wilderness, convinced the end of the world was coming soon. It was a society full of tension, argument, and expectation. Into this swirling mix, Jesus would bring a message that challenged both tradition and empire. But before he spoke, he learned what it meant to live at the edge between town and city, old ways and new power and hope. As Jesus grew older, the air in Judea grew ever more charged with debate and expectation. While Roman coins changed hands in every market and Greek words echoed through city streets, ordinary Jewish families gathered around their tables each night to retell ancient promises that God would one day deliver them from oppression. But even among their own people, opinions clashed. The Pharisees believed the secret to survival was strict faithfulness to the law, keeping kosher, observing Sabbath, holding fast to tradition. The Sadducees, more aligned with the temple, and the elite cooperated with the Romans to maintain order and keep their privileges. The Zealots, meanwhile, grew restless, whispering of revolt and carrying knives beneath their cloaks, convinced only violence could bring freedom. On the fringes of society, the Essenes withdrew into the wilderness, living in isolated communities. They believed the world was so corrupted that God would soon intervene in a dramatic, apocalyptic way, destroying evil, punishing oppressors, and creating a new age of justice. Into this world stepped prophets like John the Baptist, who preached in the barren hills and riverbanks. His voice thundered with warnings. Repent, for God's kingdom is near. Crowds from cities and villages flocked to hear him, hoping for answers, hungry for hope. Jesus himself was drawn to these movements. The message of John of radical change and divine justice made a deep impression, but Jesus would soon find his own path, a vision not only of a new world coming, but a call for people to change themselves here and now. He began to teach with stories, parables using images from daily life scenes, soil mustard plants, lost coins, shepherds, and sheep. Sometimes the meaning was clear, other times mysterious, forcing listeners to think, to question, and to wrestle with their own hearts. It was a world on edge searching for hope, and Jesus' message would both inspire and divide as old certainties gave way to new possibilities. The more Jesus spoke, the more his words stirred both excitement and unease. He didn't call for armed revolt, but he challenged people to see their world and themselves in radically new ways. His parables weren't just clever stories. They questioned the status quo, turning conventional wisdom upside down. To some, Jesus' message was thrilling, a vision of a kingdom where the poor and meek are lifted up, the outcasts welcomed, and forgiveness triumphs over vengeance. His miracles healing the sick, feeding the hungry, even raising the dead brought hope to the desperate and drew crowds wherever he went. But to others, especially those in power, his growing influence was a threat. As the annual festival of Passover approached Jerusalem, swelled with pilgrims, the city was already a powder keg, and the presence of Roman soldiers only heightened the tension. For Jews, Passover was more than a holiday. It was a reminder of freedom from oppression, the promise that God could overthrow any tyrant. Jesus entered Jerusalem not as a warrior, but riding a humble donkey. Still, the crowd's excitement was unmistakable. Some saw in him a new Moses come to free his people. Once again, he went straight to the temple, the very heart of Jewish life, and overturned the tables of the money changers, accusing them of turning a house of prayer into a den of thieves. It was a bold, unmistakable act of protest loaded with both spiritual and political meaning. The authorities took notice. Both the high priests and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate watched with increasing alarm. To them, any disruption at Passover was dangerous. One spark could ignite a rebellion. Secret meetings, betrayals, and fear followed. Jesus was arrested, tried, and condemned to death. His crucifixion was a public warning. This is what happens to anyone who challenges the established order. The message was meant to terrify, to erase hope, and to silence a movement before it began. His followers scattered, broken-hearted and afraid, convinced the story had ended in tragedy. But history once again had other plans. The story might have ended at the cross, as so many others had before crucifixion was the Roman Empire's ultimate warning, a public display designed to erase hope and erase memory. But something remarkable happened in the days that followed. Jesus' followers, hiding in fear and grief, began to speak of visions, encounters, and a conviction that death was not the end. They said Jesus had risen. At first, only whispers, stories shared in locked rooms, fragments of hope pieced together by the grieving and the lost. The news spread quickly. The tomb was empty, and some claimed to have seen him alive. The meaning of these experiences would be debated for generations, but one thing was clear. The despair of defeat had been transformed into the courage of faith. It wasn't long before the movement gained new energy. Men and women who had been afraid to speak now began to preach openly, risking arrest and death. Their message was simple but revolutionary. The kingdom of God was here, and everyone, regardless of status, gender, or origin, was welcome. Among them was a man named Paul, once a fierce opponent of Jesus' followers. After a dramatic conversion, Paul became one of the most passionate voices for the new faith. He traveled across the Roman world, preaching in synagogues and marketplaces, writing letters to communities struggling to make sense of their new identity. Paul's message broke old boundaries. He insisted that faith in Christ was for Jews and non-Jews alike, that old rules about diet and ritual no longer defined God's people. He welcomed women as leaders, invited slaves and the poor into the community, and called for a love that crossed every line society drew. Not everyone agreed. Arguments and conflicts erupted at every turn, but the seeds had been sown for a movement that would outlast empires. What had begun as a story of defeat was now a story of hope, resilience, and radical inclusion. The earliest Christian communities were born into a world of uncertainty and risk. To gather in Jesus' name was to invite suspicion from both Roman authorities and other Jews. There were debates, sometimes fierce, about what it meant to follow Jesus. Should new converts obey Jewish dietary laws? Did men need to be circumcised? Was this new movement just another branch of Judaism or something entirely new? Arguments broke out between leaders. Paul clashed with Peter and James in Jerusalem over questions of tradition and identity. Some early Christians wanted to keep old boundaries, while others saw faith in Jesus as a doorway to a radically inclusive future. These disputes were not hidden. They were written into letters, discussed in meetings, even argued about at shared meals. Yet even in disagreement, the movement grew. Its appeal was both spiritual and practical. For many, the Christian community offered something Roman society did not. A place where women could teach the poor, were fed, and social barriers were crossed. Stories spread of miracles, healings, and a love that overcame every division. But this openness came at a price. As Christian communities appeared in cities across the empire, Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Rome, they drew the attention of Roman officials. The name Christian itself became dangerous, a mark of defiance against the old gods and the imperial order. Still, the followers of Jesus persisted. They met in homes and back rooms, hiding from authorities, yet determined to care for each other. They welcomed refugees, cared for widows and orphans, and remembered their teachers' words. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Amid turmoil, persecution, and debate, Christianity survived, held together by shared meals, shared stories, and an unbreakable hope that love was stronger than fear. As the decades passed, the world around the early Christians grew more dangerous. Political tensions in Judea escalated as Rome's rule became harsher, and local resistance flared into open revolt. In the year 66, CE Jerusalem erupted in rebellion. Zealots seized control of the city and defied the might of the Roman legions. The conflict was brutal and the consequences devastating. Roman armies soon surrounded Jerusalem. The city, swollen with refugees and fighters, became a place of famine, fear, and desperate hope. When the Romans finally breached the walls, they unleashed a storm of violence. The temple, the heart of Jewish faith, was set ablaze. Its treasures plundered, its stones thrown down. The city itself became a graveyard, and those who survived fled for their lives. This was a turning point, not only for Judaism, but for the followers of Jesus as well. Many early Christians had remained in Jerusalem, seeing themselves as a part of the Jewish people. But the destruction of the city and the trauma that followed forced them to rethink who they were and what their mission would be. As refugees scattered across the empire, Christian communities became more independent. They were no longer just a branch of Judaism, but a movement finding its own identity. Stories and memories of Jesus, his teachings, his suffering, and his promise of hope became a source of unity for believers far from their homeland. Yet with the loss came new questions. Could God's promises survive the loss of the temple? Could a faith born in suffering become a source of healing for the world? Early Christians began to reimagine themselves as a spiritual family open to anyone who would join, and bound together not by law or sacrifice, but by the story of a man who turned defeat into hope. After the fall of Jerusalem, everything changed. For the first time, Christians were truly on their own. No temple, no homeland, and no protection from the powers that ruled the world. Yet this sense of loss did not break the movement. Instead, it forged a new identity, one that was adaptable, resilient, and open to people from every corner of the empire. Christian communities spread through the great cities: Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, Rome, where life was fast, diverse, and often precarious. In these urban centers, new believers brought their own backgrounds, questions, and struggles. Some were former pagans, drawn by the promise of salvation and a loving community. Others were Jews searching for hope in the wake of catastrophe. Many were poor, powerless, and invisible to society. Yet in the church they found belonging and purpose. As the movement grew, it also attracted more attention and more danger. The simple act of gathering for worship, of calling Jesus Lord instead of Caesar, was an act of defiance. The Roman authorities, suspicious of any group that refused to honor the state gods, began to crack down. To be called Christian was enough to mark someone for arrest, exile, or even death. But persecution did not stop the spread of the faith. In fact, it made the bonds of the community even stronger. Christians cared for each other. Visited prisoners shared their possessions and comforted the grieving. They welcomed strangers as brothers and sisters, confident that nothing, not even death, could separate them from the love at the heart of their story. Through suffering and struggle, Christianity moved from the shadows to the center stage of history. It became not just a movement of survivors, but a beacon of hope for a weary world, promising that even in darkness, the light of compassion and faith could not be extinguished. Over time, what began as a small persecuted sect transformed into a movement with staying power. Early Christians learned to adapt building networks across cities and regions, communicating by letters and trusted messengers. They created rituals like baptism and the shared meal that forged unity even among people who had never met face to face. The message of hope, love, and life after death continued to draw new followers from every walk of life. But with growth came new challenges. Debates over belief and leadership intensified. Who could be trusted to teach? Which stories and letters truly reflected Jesus' message? Communities struggled to balance openness with the need to protect themselves from betrayal and false teaching. As some Christians achieved influence and resources, tensions grew between those with power and those without. Women who had led in earlier days sometimes found themselves pushed to the margins as the movement became more structured. Still, in the midst of these struggles, the sense of mission endured. Christians reached out to the sick and dying during plagues, cared for orphans and widows when others turned away, and offered reconciliation where old hatreds ran deep. Stories circulated about ordinary believers who forgave their persecutors or risked everything to rescue the vulnerable. These acts of mercy and courage set the movement apart and fueled its continued spread. Eventually, after centuries of trial and endurance, the world began to change. From the secret gatherings of the persecuted, Christianity emerged as a recognized faith, one that would shape art, culture, and politics across continents. But even as it gained public acceptance, the true heart of the story remained with those who practiced quiet compassion and radical hope, following the example of a carpenter's son from Nazareth, who challenged the world with love. The story that began in obscurity on the edge of an empire in a troubled land with a child born into poverty did not end in tragedy. Instead, it became a living tradition echoing across centuries and continents. From hidden gatherings in candlelit rooms to soaring cathedrals and modern churches, the story of Jesus continued to inspire, challenge, and unite people who otherwise had little in common. Christianity's journey has been far from simple. It has faced persecution and power division and reconciliation, moments of darkness and bursts of dazzling hope. In every era, believers have debated what it means to follow Jesus, how to live his teachings, how to build communities of justice and mercy, and how to face suffering with courage. For some, the faith became a banner for empires and armies. For others, it remained a refuge for the poor, the outcast, and the oppressed. At its best, the Christian story has fueled movements for compassion, forgiveness, and social change, offering healing where there was brokenness and hope where there was despair. But at its core, the legacy of Jesus is not about buildings or institutions, but about people, ordinary men and women who choose love over fear, generosity over greed, and hope over resignation. The story's power comes not from its victories in history, but from its quiet revolutions in the human heart. As the centuries pass, the questions first raised in ancient Judea remain. What does it mean to seek truth, to forgive, to serve? The answers are never simple, but the story endures a reminder that even from the humblest beginnings, lives can be changed, and through them the world